What if the loudest sound on Earth wasn't thunder, but ice picture? A horizon swallowed by a shining wall hundreds of meters high, its face veined in impossible blues. The air is thin and dry enough to sting your lungs. Then a crack deep and cathedral low rolls across the plains as the ice shifts its weight. You feel it in your ribs more than you hear it. This was not winter. This was a planet wrapped in power. The Ice Age did not arrive as a single freeze and leave as a single thaw. It breathed. Glacial cold advanced like a patient tide, then pulled back into brief, warm interludes. Over and over. Across tens of thousands of years. The engine behind it was subtle and celestial, tiny changes in Earth's orbit, in the angle of its tilt, and in the wobble of its spinning top. Those nudges, imperceptible to any one lifetime, rearranged sunlight across the hemispheres and quietly redrew the map of the world. And yet, the world under that sky was not empty. On a vast, wind-swept grassland that scientists later named the Mammoth Steppe, herds moved like living weather. Woolly mammoths, shoulders higher than a door, carved paths through brittle grass. Saber-toothed cats waited in the dusk, long canines catching what little light the sun offered. In the Americas, ground sloths, big as small trucks, reached calmly into trees and pulled them close, farther south, where ice never claimed the land. Rivers threaded through forest, and seasons still breathed in something like the pattern we know. Now, step into the scene as a human would have no map, no history, just hunger and the ache of cold. Your band travels along the edge of the Great White, following the dark rope of animals across the steppe. A spear tipped with stone is weight in your palm. Smoke on the air means fire and safety. You don't know that sea levels have fallen by the height of a 40-story building, exposing new hunting grounds and land bridges. You don't know that the cadence of summers is being written into bubbles of air, hidden deep inside the ice above you, to be read one day like pages in a book. You just know that the wind cuts through fur, and that stories told around flame tighten the weave of a group that must face the morning together. Stay with us, because this isn't only a story about cold, it's a story about motion. Ice sheets flowed slow rivers of stone-hard water, grinding mountains to powder, polishing valleys, leaving behind bowls that would later fill to become the Great Lakes. When warmth nudged the balance, meltwater stored for centuries burst free in floods that tore new canyons in days. In the Pacific Northwest, entire landscapes were scored by repeated outbursts as glacial dams failed. Elsewhere, braided rivers dropped thick fans of gravel that still steer today's streams. Wind, relentless on the exposed plains, lifted the finest rock dust and let it settle in blankets loess, layer after layer. From China's plateau to the American Midwest, even now, crops root in that ancient powder, a quiet inheritance of ice. Under this sky, life learned to hack the code of survival. Some insects made antifreeze proteins to keep their cells from freezing solid. Birds that stayed through the cold, packed down in their feathers, and stoked a furnace of metabolism. Grazing animals rotated swiftly across the short green wave of summer, banking fat against the long dark. Humans built with what the land allowed in treeless regions. Frames of mammoth ribs, tusks, and skulls, skinned with hides to hold back the wind. Inside, a single fire beat a perimeter against the night. Around it, tools scraped hides into soft, tight-sewn clothing, awls punched clean holes for stitching, stone blades napped to an edge keen as glass promised food, shelter, and time. But the most surprising thing blooms far from starlight, in a darkness chosen, not imposed, deep inside caves, torch smoke curled across limestone. Hands, steady and practiced, laid down lines of ochre and charcoal mammoths with the weight of memory in their shoulders. Bison frozen mid-breath, horses painted with a grace that feels modern. In that wavering light, something new took root, seeing not just to survive the world, but to understand it, to name it, to remember. The Ice Age forged art as surely as it forged valleys, above ground. The Great White wasn't constant. Within the grand swing from cold to warmth, there were jolts, sudden pulses of climate that rippled through ocean currents and atmosphere alike. A shift in the conveyor belt of the Atlantic could pull heat north or push it away. Ash from faraway volcanoes could dim sunlight long enough to stall a melt. To a hunting band, such physics had no names, but their signatures were felt in every decision: where to track herds, when to risk the crossing of a river, how closely to cling to one another when the wind began to sound like a living thing. All the while, the sea waited at the margins. As ice locked up water, shorelines strode outward, bays became meadows, islands became peninsulas, an entire world called Beringia unfurled between Asia and North America. Not as a narrow causeway, but as a continent of grass and river, wide enough to host seasons of migration. People, mammoths, and bison all moved there. Some stayed, some kept going. Footsteps in silt became routes, became memory, became ancestry. Scale is the teacher here. At the height of the last great cold, ice covered roughly a third of all land. A single sheet sprawled across Canada into the northern United States. Another ruled Scandinavia and northern Europe. Their weight bowed the crust itself. Their melt later let it rise again, slowly, like a bruise fading. To stand at their edge was to feel small. Yes, but also to feel the world as a body in motion, full of processes, vast and slow, yet intimate enough to touch your face as wind. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes. In lake chains blue as new steel, in hills smoothed like knuckles under skin, in soils that hold the ghost of ground rock and wind-blown dust, in the way we gather when the world feels uncertain, drawn to flame, to story, to the simple nearness of other people. The Ice Age is not simply behind us. It is under us, within us, and all around us, in the shapes of the land, in the habits of our species. And that crack you imagined at the start, it's not just a sound from the past. It's the opening line of a longer story. A planet learning how to shift weight. A species learning how to watch and remember. Walk forward with us, deeper into the cold, and you'll start to see how that sound shaped everything you stand on now. What if the sun's fire stayed the same, but winter still conquered continents? Imagine a planet whose fate is steered not by eruptions or comet strikes, but by 3 silent gears turning in the dark, stretched out orbit, a leaning axis, and a slow celestial wobble. Together, they don't change how much sunlight Earth receives in a year, but they do reshuffle when and where that light lands. And in the north, in summer, that timing is everything. if enough snow survives those short summers, the next winter doesn't start from zero. It starts on a banked deposit of white, year after year, bank after bank. Ice climbs into power. Start with the lean. Earth does not stand upright, it tilts over roughly 41,000 years. That tilt obliquity rocks between about 22.1 degrees and 24.5 das. A larger tilt exaggerates seasons' hotter summers, colder winters, especially at high latitudes. A smaller tilt flattens contrast, counterintuitively. It's the cool, high-latitude summers that tempt glaciers to grow, when summers are too weak to melt the previous winter's snow. Albeit the mirror-bright reflectivity of ice does the rest. More snow reflects more sunlight, which keeps things cooler, which preserves more snow. A feedback loop clicks into place. Now, spin the top like a slowing gyroscope. Earth's axis wobbles precession on cycles of about 19,000 and 23,000 years. Precession shifts the calendar of the seasons relative to our position in the orbit. Sometimes, northern summers occur when Earth is a little closer to the sun. Sometimes, they arrive when we're farther. The difference sounds minor. It isn't. Shift just a few percent of sunshine away from a brief Arctic summer, and kilometers of ice can keep their edge, stretch the orbit. Earth's path around the sun is not a perfect circle. It breathes in and out eccentricity on 100,000-year rhythms, tuning how strongly precession matters. When the orbit is more elliptical, the contrast between the closer and farther seasons grows, amplifying whatever precession is trying to do. When it's rounder, precession whispers, alone. Eccentricity is weak as a trigger, as a conductor of the orchestra. It's decisive. Stay with us here, because this quiet astronomy is the key to the loudest story on Earth. The grand pattern it creates is visible in the ice itself. Drill miles into Antarctica or Greenland, and you unspool time-banded layers of snow, turn to fern, turn to crystal. Each trapping bubbles of ancient air. Measure the chemical fingerprints, ratios of heavy to light oxygen, traces of dust, pulses of greenhouse gases, and a sawtooth emerges, long slides into cold, then abrupt leaps into warmth. In ocean mud, shells of tiny plankton record the same beat. In 1976, a trio of scientists compared these marine stacks to the math of orbital cycles and found the frequencies lined up like gears clicking into place. What Milankovitch calculated on paper decades earlier. The planet had written into stone and ice, but orbits set the stage. Feedbacks write the script. Begin with albedo, then add the oceans. When ice grows, sea level falls by tens of meters, exposing bright continental shelves and altering coastal winds. Colder oceans absorb more carbon dioxide, which cools the atmosphere further. Dust rises on drier plains and settles on ice, sometimes darkening it melting, sometimes fertilizing ocean blooms that pull more CO2 from the air, cooling. Vast ice sheets flatten jet streams, reroute storms, and throttle the heat conveyor of the Atlantic. None of these acts alone. Together, they create threshold points where a small orbital nudge tips a huge system. There were jolts inside the rhythm. In Greenland's ice, you can read abrupt warmings called Dansgaard-Weschger events. Temperature jumps that unfolded in decades, not millennia. In the North Atlantic, you find Heinrich layers, thick dumps of ice-rafted debris, evidence that armadas of icebergs once broke loose and sailed south, freshening the sea and stalling currents. And near the Ice Age's last bow, a sharp rebound to cold the Younger Dryas froze the North again for more than 1,000 years before warmth surged back, superimposed on the slow dance of tilt, wobble, and stretch. These spasms remind us the climate machine can lurch as well as glide. The story also evolves over deep time. Early in the Pleistocene, the 41,000-year tilt cycle dominated. Then, between about 1.2 million and 800,000 years ago, the mid-Pleistocene transition. The system shifted into longer, bigger freezes that pulse near 100,000 years. Why did ice sheets start skipping beats? Hypotheses range from the slow erosion of regolith beneath ice sheets allowing thicker, more stable ice to build, to CO2, baselines edging lower, to long-term tectonic and weathering changes that altered feedback strength. The lesson is sobering and elegant. The same orbital music can produce different dances when the floor, the dancers, and the air change, all of which brings us to the latitude that matters most. Climatologists keep returning to a deceptively simple metric summer sunshine at 65 degrees north boreal high latitudes, where giant ice sheets either die or endure. If June insolation there is strong for long enough, winter's legacy melts. If it weakens and stays weak, and if feedbacks cooperate, snow stacks up into something that can bully continents. It isn't that the South is irrelevant, it's that the North's geometry, with land masses ready to host ice, makes it the swing vote. You can watch the consequences roll across maps. As glaciations swell, sea levels drop more than 100 meters, revealing land bridges river-laced Beringia between Asia and North America, broad shelves around Southeast Asia turning islands into peninsulas, coastlines marching outward like low tide on a planetary scale. Monsoons shift with the thermal contrast between ocean and land. Stalagmites in distant caves grow faster or slower, quietly logging wet and dry years in rings of calcite. Even deserts respond, dunes advance, then rest. Loess stacks thicken where winds have a clear fetch across bare ground. And yet, for all the mechanics, the human scale remains immediate to a band stalking bison at the edge of the ice. These cycles are felt as seasons a little brighter or dimmer, rivers a little higher or lower, winds that arrive from a slightly different quarter. The cosmos is moving, but the choice is always local: cross now or wait, follow the herds north or camp in the lee of a ridge, burn precious fat or share it. Astronomy becomes anthropology, one decision at a time. The marvel is that we can see at all the gears overhead and the footprints below and read their dialogue across hundreds of thousands of years. The Ice Age was not one freeze. It was a score written in light and played by ice, ocean, rock, and air, with life improvising in the spaces between. Learn the rhythm, and the rest of the story, the floods, the migrations, the extinctions and rebirths, will make a new kind of sense. If a mountain could move, this is how it would sound: a low, rib-deep groan rolling across open plains, punctuated by thunderclaps as blue-veined ice fractures and heals in the same breath. Ahead stands a horizon made of glacier, its face hundreds of meters high where it meets the land, its crown lost in pale haze. You don't see trees, you see a wall. It is not scenery, it is a power across North America. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets pressed south until their tongues hovered over what is now the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet shouldered down across Scandinavia and into today's Germany and Poland. At their margins, the world was a gallery of strange forms, ridges of bulldozed stone called moraines, streamlined hills, drumlins pointing like arrows in the direction of flow, long, sinuous ridges, eskers poured by rivers that once ran in tunnels beneath the ice, where buried ice blocks melted. The ground collapsed into kettles that later filled as lakes. None of this looked tidy. All of it felt deliberate. Stand closer. The air hardens, dry and metallic on the tongue. Katabatic winds slide off the ice face like cold waterfalls, scouring the steppe. Crevasses open with a report that startles birds into the air. Somewhere inside that blue maze, meltwater hisses down shafts, pressurized and impatient. The ice doesn't march, it grinds. Boulders captive in its base sandpaper the earth. Outwash rivers burst from tunnel mouths, milk white with rock flour, braiding into fans that sparkle and shift with every flood. And yet, against this colossus, life clung and adapted. South of the ice front stretched the steppe tundra, wind-tough grasses and herbs, dwarf willow, and birch hugging the ground to dodge the blade of the gale. Saiga antelope cut fast lines over the flats. Musk ox shouldered through drifts like living snowplows. Woolly mammoths traced memory paths to salt licks and water, their tusks sweeping frost from forage. In Eurasia, woolly rhinoceros and cave lions held their own. In the Americas, dire wolves and short-faced bears haunted the edges of herds. Nothing stayed still for long. The short, fierce summers arrived like a drumbeat. The green wave racing north, animals and people. Animals and people surged with it, then fell back when the year tilted toward dark. Humans learned to live in the lee, where wood was scarce. They framed shelters with mammoth ribs and tusks, skinned them with hides, sealed seams with marrow fat and sinew. Inside, a single fire kept a fragile perimeter against a night that could kill in hours. Hands stitched tight-fitting coats, boots, and mitts, stone blades, fresh flaked and glass keen, parted hide and tendon cleanly, throwing spears and later. Spear throwers gave hunters reach enough to risk big game without stepping into the arc of a tusk. They set camps near river mouths and on rises that caught the weak sun, watching for the breath clouds of herds. Food meant fat first, fuel for brains, and for furnaces of muscle, then meat, then bone for tools and shelter. Around the flames, stories soldered memory to skill where the ice had advanced this year, where the river had cut a new channel, where a band of wolves had learned to challenge men instead of shadow them. Stay with us as we walk the edge, because this is the line where worlds meet ice heavy enough to bow the crust and land just warm enough to receive the runoff. In pulse years, proglacial lakes gathered behind walls of ice and debris, swelling until the dam failed. When it did, whole regions changed in days. Floods exploded from the ice front, scouring channels into bare rock, throwing house-sized boulders like toys, leaving behind coulees, cataracts, and dry falls where water once roared. Elsewhere, meltwater spread like a silver net, laying down wide plains of gravel that would steer future rivers long after the ice had gone. The ice wrote its signatures vertically as well as across the map. Valleys once V-shaped under rivers were pressed into wide U's. Fjords invited the sea deep into the land where ice had raked below today's shoreline. Hills were polished into whalebacks roche moutonnées, with one side smoothed and the lee plucked ragged. Far from any bedrock source, lonely boulders, erratics rested like riddles in fields, hauled there under a ceiling of ice, then set down when the ceiling melted away. After the retreat, the ground itself rebounded centimeters a year as the crust rose from under the dead weight, leaving ancient shorelines stranded like rings in a bathtub around uplands and bays for all its scale. The wall's influence felt intimate. Climate tightened into hard contrasts, winters that could shatter bone, summers that went hot in a hurry on cloudless plains. Winds ran long fetches over new, dry ground, lofting fine dust and laying it down in lush blankets, quiet fertility, still feeding fields in China and the American Midwest. Animals tuned their lives to this tempo. Arctic ground squirrels hibernated so deeply, their body temperatures sank near freezing. Caribou carved reliable migration lanes whose ghosts can still be traced in the lay of modern trails. Apex predators learned to read our species, probing for fear, learning the cost of a contest, sometimes taking it anyway. People read the ice, too. A glossy sheen on the face signaled hard. Cold conditions and little meltwater, a pitted, dirty surface meant warmth and treachery. Thin lids over hidden streams. The groan of nocturnal movement warned of morning calving. Bands learned to use the ice front as a map, follow its margin to freshwater, to grazing, to shelter. When sea levels fell and coastlines strode outward, new hunting grounds opened on shelves now dry. When the ice paused, the land around its feet stabilized long enough for season after season to leave hearth ash in the same soil. Beyond the visible wall lay other boundaries you could feel. Jet streams slumped and kinked under the weight of the ice, steering storms along stubborn tracks. Storms arrived sharp-edged, dumping snow in belts that bent cleanly around the high plateau of frozen water. Clear nights cut so hard you could taste metal. On such nights, the sky felt close, bright with stars that seemed to draw frost up from the ground, somewhere in that blue-black. A wolf's call could lengthen the back of your neck, and then the wall moved. Not quickly, never quickly, to the human eye, but steadily. Over lives and generations, in cold phases. It advanced meters a year, swallowing hills whole and grinding forests into pulp. In warmer pulses, it slackened and withdrew, writing scalloped patterns of recessional moraines down valleys like the stitch marks of a giant tailor. Each step back released floods, winds, and space. Each step forward reclaimed them. The edge was a pendulum, and everything alive learned to sway. When at last you look away from the face and scan the horizon, you begin to see the future hiding in the present. Those kettles will be ponds, and then lakes, where fish will flash. Those gravel sheets will cradle rivers that braid and unbraid for millennia. Those erratics will be landmarks, then legends. The wall is not just an ending. It is a beginning carved in ice. What walks like a thunderhead and remembers where the grass will green. Out on the Mammoth steppe, an empire of wind and light, the ground itself seemed to move. A dark tide of backs and tusks rolled over the horizon, hooves drumming frozen earth, breath crystallizing into banners. From a distance, you might think the land was alive. Up close, you'd learn it was. These were the titans that made the cold world work mammoths plowing snow to reach buried forage. Saber-toothed cats coaxing risk into meals. Giant sloths turning whole shrubs into calories with the patience of mountains. Scarcity didn't break them. It shaped them. Begin with the architect's woolly mammoths. They wore the season on their bodies, small ears to save heat, a humped fat reserve at the shoulders, and a double coat with a long shag outer layer over dense insulation under the fur. Their blood kept a secret. Mammoth hemoglobin was tuned for cold, engineered by evolution to release oxygen to chilly tissues without stalling. A biochemical trick that let muscle work when the air stung your lungs. Their tusks' great ivory sickles weren't just ornaments. In deep winter, they swept snow aside to unlock grass and sedges for the herd, carving feeding windows that other grazers raided. A matriarch's memory mapped water holes, salt licks, and safe crossings like a living atlas, in a land where the wrong ridge could kill you. Memory was a survival organ. Across the flats, another kind of giant moved in slow focus. Ground sloths like Megatherium in South America and Erematherium farther north stood as high as a room when they reared, bracing on a muscular tail while forelimbs armed with scythe-length claws raked branches close. Their strategy was the opposite of the cat's burst or the mammoth's migration, a furnace of fermentation. With a gut specialized to wring energy from coarse plants, they turned low-quality browse into bulk, trading speed for certainty. Some species even carried small bony plates in the skin natural armor stitched into hide because in a world of hungry experimenters, being hard to bite was a good policy. Now, picture the ambush you never want to meet. The saber-toothed cat was not a long-distance runner. It was a sprung trap. Stocky forelimbs and a reinforced neck anchored a killing style built around a wide jaw gape and dagger, canines targeting soft places throat, belly, inner thigh, in brush or shadowed gullies. Smilodon waited until a body of muscle and momentum came just close enough. Then, the equation solved itself in seconds. We argue about their social lives because the bones quarrel among themselves. Some fossils show healed injuries that suggest group tolerance. Others hint at solitary hunters drawn together by opportunity. Either way, a fat-laden herbivore on the ground was a jackpot big enough to feed more mouths than one. Predators were a chorus, not a solo. Dire wolves, now known to be distant cousins rather than siblings of gray wolves, ran heavy-jawed in packs built to crack bone and stand their ground. Short-faced bears, long-legged and towering, may have been sprinting kleptoparasites or wide-ranging omnivores that bullied others off kills. Cave lions shadowed herds across Eurasia, probably manyless and light on the snow. Hyenas' bone mills on legs could erase the evidence of a hunt by dawn. Each species tested the margins of the others, and the sum of those contests set the rules of the plain. What did the plain give back more than you'd think? The mammoth steppe wasn't sterile. It was a cold engine, hyper-productive in a short, fierce burst each year. Grasses and forbs surged under rain-clean skies, pumped full of summer light. Herbivores kept it open cropping, trampling, manuring, preventing shrubs from closing ranks. In turn, they carried nutrients in their bodies, moving fertility between patches with every bellyful and hoofstep. The result was a landscape that looked harsh from a hilltop and generous from ground level. Provided you moved when it did. Move they did. Mammoths traced seasonal circuits that could span hundreds of kilometers, timing births to the green wave so mothers could pour milk without starving. Bison and horses braided their own paths through the same clock, sometimes with saiga antelope flickering past like tan ghosts with high-arched noses warming winter air. Musk ox, wrapped in guard hairs that dragged the ground, formed living circles when wolves tested their line, horn tips outward, calves breathing the warm space in the middle. Even small players had big ideas. Arctic ground squirrels hibernated so deeply their body temperatures slid toward freezing, setting their metabolism on a metronome that matched the sky. There was danger in abundance. A single, successful mammoth hunt fed a band and lit its shelters. A single mistake fed the scavengers instead. To stalk giants. Humans made their own adaptations, muscle chained to patience, stone edges sharp as new ice, clothing stitched tight enough to turn wind. Camps rose where the land bent in our favor, near river mouths where herds paused, along bluffs that watched migration lanes, in the lee of eskers and moraines that broke the blade of the gale around the fire. The map was folded into story where the cats had learned a habit, where a sloth had foraged late into an unseasonal snow, where the steppe bison had surprised everyone by wintering near the coast. Stay with us, because the balance here is the point. Every giant carried the landscape in its body, and the landscape answered back. Herds kept grasslands open. Grasslands fed herds. Predators culled the unwary. Carrion fed the furtive. Bones fed the soil. A cold summer could stall calf growth. A wet spring could heal a population's losses. Rivers braided and unbraided. Ice advanced a little, then paused. Stability, when it existed, was an average of wild swings, a tightrope stretched across years and lives. That tightrope magnified missteps. A late winter storm could strip fat reserves by weeks. A reshuffled river course could snap a migration like a thread. Volcanic ash drifting in from a far horizon could frost leaves and dull the green wave. The animal's answers were written into bus mammoth tusk rings that recorded seasons of hunger and years of plenty. Tooth enamel chemistry that traced migrations like signatures, healed fractures that spoke of falls, fights, and the margin between enough and not quite. Stand again on the ridge and watch the plane move. The scale will tempt you to think only of size, but the secret of the giants is timing. They were calendars on legs, reading the light, the wind, the taste of water. They didn't conquer the ice age. They negotiated with it every hour, every season, every year until the terms changed. The terms will change. In our story, soon floods, forests, land bridges, and the long thinning of the herds. But hold this picture a moment longer. A matriarch, nudging snow aside to find last year's grass. A cat curled in shadow, saving heat for the sprint. A sloth standing to pull a branch into reach as if the tree were coming to meet it. In a land of scarcity, they made abundance move. What if the hardest place on Earth to live was also the place that made us most human? Picture a horizon of cold light and moving herds. The air so clear, it rings. A small band steps out of a windbreak at dawn, faces chapped, eyes steady, boots laced with sinew, spears tipped with stone. They don't have a word for ice age. They have words for hunger, for river ice that will hold, for snow that lies to the eye. They will cross a day's worth of frozen grass to reach a rise where bison pause. If they come back with fat, the children grow. If they don't, the fire burns lower, and the wind gets a vote. Everything is organized around that vote. Camps appear where the land bends in their favor, behind a ridge that breaks the gale, beside braided channels where herds narrow to cross, near a spring that does not freeze. Wood is precious, so bones become beams. Mammoth ribs and tusks lash into domes. Hides stretched tight and sealed with marrow. In river valleys, with willow thickets. Bent poles make low. Fast shelters quick to warm, quick to abandon. Hearths blacken the ground in circles that return season after season. A breadcrumb trail of memory burned into soil. Clothing is technology you can't afford to get wrong. Eyed bone needles. Small miracles turn hide into tailored armor. Parkas cut with gussets keep heat where bodies make it. Boots are two-layered soft inner liners, changed and dried each night. Outer moccasins oiled against slush and edged with rawhide to bite ice. Mitts hang from cords so they can't be lost in a scramble. Sinew thread shrinks as it dries. Tightening seams. Fur is placed with the grain. Windward hairs facing out. A good coat is a second hearth you carry. Tools multiply at the edge of need. Stone cores ride in satchels like seeds, flaked on demand into blades keen as glass. Hafting is chemistry, birch bark tar and pine resin, warmed and softened. Marry stone to wood, a wrapping of sinew shrinks to clamp it solid. Scrapers thin hides without tearing. Awls punch neat lines for stitching. Birens carve bone for needles and points. Spears begin as thrusting weapons and, in some regions and times, gain leverage from throwers' wooden extensions that turn an arm into a catapult. A well-made point is currency. A straight shaft is a promise. A spare is the difference between a story and a caution. Hunting is patient math. The first number is wind. The second is ground quiet snow or crust that screams underfoot. The third is distance, measured not in meters, but in heartbeats before a herd wheels. Drive lines of brush and stones narrow animals toward an ambush. On open steppe. Speed belongs to hooves. Humans trade for strategy. They choose choke points, river fords. Ravines. The foot of a moraine where the ice has penned the plain into a funnel. In winter. Mammoths scrape snow to feed, and their paths are highways in spring. Bison follow the first green like a tide. In autumn. Fat on the ribs decides where courage begins and ends. A successful kill becomes many jobs at once. Meat is sliced thin to dry in air that gives little to rot. Marrow is tapped like a savings account. Bones are cracked. Boiled with hot stones to render grease calories that will move with the band when the world does. Not all food walks. Fish stack up below riffles when ice lets go. Birds come like weather and can be taken with nets. Roots dug from thawed patches carry the taste of the dark. patient ground. Berries burn like small fires in summer and disappear into stomachs or skin bags before the cold returns. Nothing is wasted that can be carried. What can't be carried is cached and sealed in pits that freeze the way a cave keeps time. Fire is the center and the teacher. It dries boots and thoughts. It hardens spear points and softens glue. It keeps cats at a respectful distance and brings the band close enough to become a we around it. Decisions are braided with stories. The ice advanced 2 valleys this year. The river cut a new channel where the willows used to be. A pack of wolves learned to test our line and paid for the lesson. Maps are sung before they're drawn ridgelines in water. The smell of a saddle pass. The angle of sun on a cliff that means there's shelter behind it. Children fall asleep to the rhythm and rise knowing the route. Stay with us, because these lives were not only hard, they were precise. People read snow the way a sailor reads a sea. A faint ripple under crust means hollow beneath. A gray sheen on river ice means flow fast enough to steal your feet. They taste water for the tannin of hardwood. They smell the metallic hint of storm. They study the sky for a halo around the moon, the kind that means wind by morning. Timing is the grand instrument births placed near the green wave so milk stays fat. Long moves made when ice can still carry weight. Heavy work done when the sun lingers and hands can feel. They were not alone in their knowing. Dogs, somewhere in this long, cold corridor, began to choose us as much as we chose them. The bold and the calm hung at the edge of campfires. The ones that tolerated our nearness got meat. Then names, then jobs, even before sleds and harness. A dog's ears and nose extended human range. They'd pace at night, worn before eyes could see, and find a rabbit under crust that a child could never hear. Partnership turned risk into something shareable. Art and music were not luxuries. They were tools for holding a world in the head. On cave walls, animals breathed out of the rock in ochre and charcoal, not to decorate, but to remember to teach the slope of a shoulder, the timing of a herd, the idea that a thing can be 2 things at once, meat and mystery. Bone flutes piped notes that would carry across a valley's hush. Beads and ochre marked bonds, kinship, and promise visible across languages. Trade moved ideas, and stone obsidian knives found far from the volcanoes that birthed them. Shells carried inland, pigments chosen for a red that the local ground could not give. The band itself was an engineering solution to a problem with too many variables. It flexed with season and survival families fusing for a drive, splitting to forage narrow, merging again at a rich river mouth. Leadership was competence you could point to the hunter who always knew where wind would turn, the elder who remembered a spring under the drifts, the healer who could stitch skin and quiet fever. Justice was immediate and practical. Generosity was insurance. A reputation could travel farther than a person and arrive before them like a passport. And through it all, there was tenderness that rarely fossilizes. A child's mitten tied to a cord so it wouldn't be lost. A healed fracture on an elder's femur proof that others carried their weight for months. A cache left heavy with fat, covered well, and shared later with a band not your own. The cold was not a character you defeated. It was a system you learned, one detail at a time, again and again, until the details looked like wisdom. Walk back into the wind for a moment and look at them. looking at you, faces red with cold, hands busy, plans inside their eyes. They are not primitive, they are exact. They are us, tuned to a sharper climate, building a circle of firelight in a world that kept trying to blow it out and building it again the next day without complaint. What if the planet kept a diary and sealed each page in glass? Imagine lowering a hollow drill into the heart of Antarctica or Greenland and bringing up a cylinder of blue-white ice, banded like tree rings and dense as stone. Hold it to the light, and you'll see history's summer snow pressed flat into winter. Winter into fern, fern into ice. But the real treasure is invisible tiny bubbles of ancient air trapped as the snow closed in. Crack that core in a clean, cold lab in the past sighs into instruments the breath of mammoths, the smoke of volcanoes, the chemistry of a sky that hasn't existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The first secret these cores tell is temperature. Written in the water itself, ice holds a faint isotopic accent, a different ratio of heavy to light oxygen and hydrogen, V18O and DD, depending on how cold the clouds were when the snow fell. Plot those ratios down core, and a sawtooth appears long slides into glacial cold, punctuated by sharp leaps into warmth. That rhythm matches the slow gears of Earth's orbit, tilt and wobble. But the cores add something orbital math can't texture. You can see winters stacked upon winters, summers barely strong enough to bite back, and abrupt climate jolts so fast they read like torn pages. Then come the gases, time capsuled in those bubbles. Carbon dioxide and methane rise and fall with the ice, partnering with temperature rather than leading it in every moment, but amplifying the story. In cold phases, CO2 is lower. In warm phases, higher. Methane tracks wetlands and monsoons, flickering with the pulse of tropical rain. The absolute numbers matter the peaks and troughs, but so does the pacing. At the end of the last ice age, greenhouse gases climbed in step with warming, a feedback that turned small orbital nudges into a planetary shift you could feel in rock and river. Dust is the third voice, a measure of wind and dryness. During deep glacials, when sea level falls and continents wear more bare skin, winds run long fetches and loft fine rock flour into the sky. Much of it settles on ice sheets far downwind, sprinkling layers you can spot with the naked eye. Those brownish bands aren't just decoration. They log the strength of the atmospheric engine. A dustier world is a harsher one. Fewer forests to anchor soil. Wider deserts. Colder oceans gulping carbon and giving little moisture back to land. Stay with us, because the ice also records moments when the climate machine lurched. Greenland's cores carry a barcode of abrupt warmings, the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, where winter temperatures jumped by several degrees in the span of decades, then slid back. In the North Atlantic's sediments, thick layers of coarse debris, the Heinrich layers announce armadas of icebergs that broke free and sailed south, freshening the ocean and weakening heat-carrying currents. Align the ice and the ocean, and a picture emerges. Circulation can change quickly, and when it does, weather follows, like a tethered animal. Volcanoes leave unmistakable fingerprints. Each major eruption rains microscopic shards of volcanic glass tephra and sprinkles sulfate aerosols through the stratosphere in cores. This becomes a needle-fine spike in acidity and sulfate concentration. Sometimes paired with identifiable ash grains, you can match to a specific source. These spikes are timestamps you can align ice from different drill sites by a single explosive moment, but they're also climate experiments no lab could ethically run. After the biggest blasts, sunlight dims for a year or two. Snow chemistry and accumulation respond. Winds may shift. In deeper time, layers corresponding to super eruptions show how sensitive the system can be. While also revealing its resilience, the world absorbs the shock, then returns to the slow beat of orbit and ocean. Ice cores don't tell the story alone. Far from the poles, the seafloor keeps its own archive. Tiny shells of foraminifera, grown in surface waters and then settling to the abyss, lock in the isotopic and chemical signature of the ocean they lived in. Stack enough of them, and you can read global ice volume via D18O, past temperatures via Mg's Ca ratios, and even nutrient patterns that hint at wind and dust. These records stretch back millions of years, carrying the beat of glacial cycles through epochs when the planet's background conditions were different, and reminding us that the same orbital sheet music plays differently on different stages. Caves write in dripstone. Stalagmites grow in layers thin as fingernails, their calcite rings dated precisely with uranium-thorium clocks. Within those rings, oxygen isotopes trace the dance of monsoons and mid-latitude storms. A stalagmite in China can tell you when East Asian rains surged. One in Brazil can log the shifting curve of the intertropical convergence zone. Match those timelines to methane wiggles and polar ice, because methane is well mixed globally and can synchronize records, and you knit continents together into a single climate canvas. On land, wind stacks its ledger in loess blankets of silt laid down over tens of thousands of years. Loess, plains in China and the American Midwest thicken during glacials, thin during interglacials, and hold buried soils like bookmarks that say here for a time. It was wetter, warmer, more stable. In some valleys, lakes lay down varves, summer silt, and winter clay couplets you can count like rings to clock the surge and slack of meltwater in young wood. Tree rings widen and tighten with temperature and rainfall, carrying the story of the Holocene in lines of pale. Living tissue. Every archive needs a calendar, and the genius of paleoclimatology is in the cross-check. Layer counting in Greenland can reach back many tens of thousands of years before uncertainty blooms. Volcanic tie points lace cores together across polar basins. Gas synchronization aligns hemispheres by matching the same methane wiggles in bubbles laid down years apart in different snows. Ocean sediments, slower to accumulate, rely on magnetic flips, ash beds, and tuning to orbital cycles. Caves bring radiometric precision. Loess brings continuity. Each method watches the others for drift. Together, these lines converge on a portrait both elegant and unnerving. The Ice Age world was not a monolith, but a system tuned to faint changes in sunlight, amplified by ice's brightness, ocean chemistry, and winds that could redraw continents in dust. It could leap as well as glide. It could recover from shocks, yet keep their memory in layered codes. And it speaks to us now, not as a relic, but as a teacher. Climate has levers, thresholds, and inertia. And the pages we open are full of both warnings and wisdom. In the end, you're back in the lab, frost ringing the metal of a clamp, listening to a soft hiss as ancient air escapes into a sensors. The monitor flickers, numbers settle. Another year, another winter, another summer joins the record. The ice does not argue. It remembers. What if the richest pasture Earth ever grew lived under the coldest sky? Picture a continent that isn't one place at all, but a single, continuous grassland braided across half the planet from Atlantic fringes in Europe, over Siberia's Great Belly, across the dry bridge of Beringia, and down into Alaska and the Yukon. No forests here to block the wind, no high snowpack to lock the land shut, just a low, endless plain silver in winter, green gold in summer, alive with hooves, tusks, horns, and the quiet machinery of grass. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, but steppe tundra might be closer to the truth, a mosaic where tough grasses and forbs ruled, with sedges in wet hollows, sage and artemisia on drier swells, dwarf willow and birch keeping their heads literally below the blade of the wind. The trick of this world wasn't warmth. It was timing and texture cold. Yes, but dry enough that snow stayed thin and crusted, letting grazers reach the forage below. Bright summers with long, unobstructed light, soils dusted with loess fine, mineral-rich silt blown from glacial outwash that made a feast out of brief seasons. Productivity didn't look like a lawn. It arrived like a tide, then retreated into roots and seeds. Waiting, follow the herds and you learn how the engine ran. Horses and bison cropped the early green. Saiga antelope with odd, high-arched noses filtered icy air and ate what others ignored. Musk ox lugged their living rugs across ridges, circling with horn tips out. When wolves tested their nerve, woolly rhinoceros grumbled through drifts like armored snowplows. Mammoths pushed snow aside with tusks, clearing feeding windows that other mouths gladly raided. Each mouth changed the plain trampling, manuring, pruning shrubs before they closed ranks. In the language of ecologists, herbivores were engineers, keeping grasslands open and the nutrient loop fast. In the language of the steppe, they were simply alive the way the wind is alive. Predators wrote their lines in the same script. Cave lions shadowed herds across Eurasia, likely manaless, built for cold air and long sightlines. Dire wolves ran heavy-jawed, betting on teamwork and endurance. Wolverines punched far above their weight, turning stubbornness into strategy. And then there was the sprung trap in the grass saber-toothed cats in the Americas. No marathoners, but masters of the burst, anchoring prey with forelimbs like pylons and ending the equation with a long, delicate blade. Scavengers hyenas in the old world, condors in the new closed the circle, moving calories back into the soil grain by grain. Stay with us, because the plain itself remembers. Permafrost holds the Yodoma thick. Ice-rich silts stitched with ancient roots and frozen plant matter that once underlay great swaths of the steppe. In those vaults, nature filed away an index pollen from grasses and sage, insect fragments with antifreeze proteins in their bodies, even mammoth hair and dung in a few places. Entire animals lay folded into the cold foals. Rhinoceros calves, wolves so complete you can still see the pattern of their coats. Open a tusk, and you can read a mammoth's life in Ring's fat years, lean years. Migrations etched in chemistry as sure as a map. Open a lake core downwind of a migration corridor, and you'll find spores of a dung-loving fungus that rise and fall with the fortunes of great herds. The steppe keeps receipts. The puzzle that still thrills scientists is how such richness flourished under such a stark sky. One answer is snow, or the lack of it, in much of this world. Winters were hard, but relatively dry. Crusted snow and wind-exposed ridges let grazers keep working instead of starving under meters of white. Another answer is loess, the gift of glaciers, as ice sheets ground mountains to flour. Winds lifted the powder and sifted it down over the steppe, refreshing soils like a slow-motion fertilizer spreader. Add the herbivore engine cropping, trampling, moving nutrients, and you get a grassland that could carry biomass comparable to Africa's savannas. With the twist that everything had to do its eating in a narrow summer window, and its waiting under a hard sky. You can walk this world in your mind by following water. Rivers ran slack and wide over permafrost, their meanders lazy, their banks raw, in spring. When the active layer thawed, the plain exhaled 100,000 wet gleams where sedges and cotton grass stood. Hummocked ground pocked with thaw lakes, braided streams running milk-white with rock flour. By late summer, the colors shifted to umbers and smoke green. Seed heads shook in a dry wind. Cranes called over distances that made the heart bigger. When cold returned, it didn't silence the plain so much as lower its voice. Humans were a thread in this weave, not yet the loom. They set camps on slight rises that caught wind enough to keep insects gentler and eyes clear to the horizon. Where wood was scarce, they lifted houses of bone mammoth skulls and ribs stacked into a frame, hides lashed tight, seams sealed with fat. In richer valleys, willow and poplar stands gave poles and kindling, their roots braided with the herd's routes. Their timing matched the green wave. Their risk calculus was written in fat first, then meat, then bone. Trade and travel stitched continents together across Beringia long before the sea returned to draw a line. The living plain had its fragilities. A late spring, or an ice crust from rain on snow could knock a cohort of calves below replacement. A shift in winds might parch one region while feeding another. Volcanoes could dust leaves, dim the sun, and make the growing season lean. Yet for tens of thousands of years, the system reset. Helped by the animals themselves, grazers keeping shrubs in check, predators preventing complacency, scavengers accelerating the return of nutrients to soil. Stability, such as it was, emerged from motion. There is a debate that lingers like a mirage over this landscape. Was the mammoth steppe held open primarily by climate? Or did herds play a keystone role in maintaining it? The answer, unfashionable in its lack of drama, is both, and the ratio likely shifted through time and place. Dry, bright conditions set the stage. Animals kept the curtain from closing. You can see echoes in modern experiments where concentrated grazing turns shrub-invaded tundra back toward grass. You can see limits where climate alone draws the line. The steppe was a contract with many signatures. If you stand on a hill of loess today, black soil in the Midwest. The Loess Plateau in China you're standing on sifted chapters of this book. If you look across a wind-sheared meadow in the Yukon, where dwarf willow grips the ground, you're looking at a faded page. The great, continuous pasture is gone. broken by forests, the warming world invited back, and by seas that rose to erase Beringia. But listen, cranes still pass, musk ox still circle, horses still lower their heads into a north wind and step forward. The lost world isn't lost so much as distributed pieces glittering wherever grass learns to make a living out of light and timing. What kind of house do you raise when the world has no trees? You lift a skeleton and teach it to hold back the wind. On the treeless tundra, families walked river terraces, littered with great white arcs and domes, mammoth ribs, jawbones, tusks, skulls, and read them as lumber. A ring of skulls pinned the base. Ribs rose like rafters. Tusks crossed overhead in pale arches, their curves lashed tight with sinew. Over this frame, hides were stretched, stitched, and sealed with warmed fat. Every seam a promise against the gale. From a distance, the dwelling looked like a snow-drifted hill. From inside, it was survival shaped by patience. You begin with a site that bends the odds, a slight rise for drainage, a shoulder that steals the bite from the wind, close to a braid of water that will loosen with spring. The ground is frozen to the bone, post holes are hacked, not dug, a circle of mammoth crania heavy. Thunder thick anchors the perimeter. Ribs are planted butt down, splayed outward to resist gusts, then tied into a dome with tusks serving as keystones. Sinew cord dries and shrinks, cinching joints like clamps. Rawhide thongs back them up. Along the base, piles of shoulder blades and mandibles form a skirt wall. Outside, snow is banked high to insulate. A low tunnel entry cut to crawl trades dignity for warmth, trapping dense cold near the floor so heated air can collect beneath the roof. Inside, smells of hide, smoke, and boiled bone. A hearth sits slightly off-center. Its floor, a plate of flat stones and compacted clay. When driftwood is rare and willow scarce, fat and bone carry the flame. Marrow and grease feed along, steady burn. Porous cancellous bone glows, smoldering into blue heat. Above the fire, a vent no wider than a palm breathes. Hides near the hole are scraped thin and treated with fat to resist embers. Smoke stains them the color of tea. Lamps' small bowls of stone or bone hold wicks of twisted plant fiber or hair. Their flames lick the shadows from faces and throw animal silhouettes across the walls. A theater where the cast is everyone within the circle. Clothing finishes what the house begins. Parkas cut with inset gussets lock warmth. Boots are double layered. Inner liners turned nightly and dried on a frame over the coals. In one corner, a rack of scraping tools and awls glints bone. Antler, flint each with a hand's polish from use. In another, a tireless scraper softens a hide. The rhythm steady as breath draw, flip, draw. Children's mittens hang from cords sewn through sleeves. Beads of shell and ivory small wealth dangle where light can catch them. A smear of ochre brightens a face before a hunt. Dogs coil near the tunnel, ears twitching at the noises the wind brings, shoulders twitching in dream. Every bone in the wall carries a backstory. Some were scavenged from old kills. Some came from hunts that fed the camp for weeks. Tusks show growth rings like trees. Their chemistry remembers where the herd traveled and when the matriarch found salt or crossed a river. Skulls keep the curve of familiar heads, ribs. Once a cage for a giant lung, become the ribs of a house. The dwelling is literally made of meals and months. It is memory arranged into architecture. Stay with us, because these were not single huts in emptiness. In rich places, you'd find clusters 4, 6, a dozen domes aligned to wind in view, their doors facing south or east. Between them, workyards blackened with charcoal, piles of cracked long bones where grease was rendered with hot stones, pits lined with hide and frozen as cellars. Here, cordage is twisted, while stories loop back on themselves. There, a point snaps and is repaired with resin and sinew. Children practice with small darts aimed at circles drawn in soot. The daily choreography wastes nothing. Heat from the hearth dries boots, softens glue, warms soup, smokes meat, and loosens laughter that the wind cannot steal. When the season turns, the same bands become light on their feet. Summer homes are skin tents raised on willow and bone, portable enough to follow fish runs and the green wave of grass. The mammoth bone houses are the deep winter answer. A decision to anchor when darkness lengthens and storms stack. Even anchored, life spirals outward, each day traps checked along drifted fences. River ice tested with a spear butt. Tracks read at first light before the sun blurs them. A good day returns with fat. A bad day returns with news. Both feed the fire. Inside the circle, teaching is the third flame after light and heat. Elders trace migration on a hide with a charred stick, the ford that changed its channel, the notch in the moraine that opens a shorter path, the long, safe way when the wind goes wrong. Nappers demonstrate pressure flaking by lamplight, a sliver riding a prepared ridge until a blade sighs free. Thin as a thought, a lullaby hums against the roof, while a newborn's hands flex in air that no longer hurts to breathe. Grief is here, too. Made ordinary by repetition, a charm tied at a doorway, a name carried forward, a pause in stories where a laugh used to live. The house holds it all without comment. Outside, the steppe reads the same but is never the same. The horizon carries a filament of blowing snow. Wolves lay a geometry of prints along a ridge. A band of saiga threads the far flats with heads angled low against the wind. The bone walls creak and settle. Frost ferns feather the hides near the floor where a stray draft sneaks. A hand smooths them away and adjusts a seam. At night, the cold presses with both palms until the roof skin tightens like a drumhead. Stars feel closer in this hard air. Somewhere beyond the dark, a glacier shifts and speaks the long, slow language of weight. Not every element came from Mammoth. Where rivers delivered timber, posts shouldered some of the load. Where snow ran deep, drifts themselves became structure, packed and cut to add mass against the wind. But at the latitude where trees fell away, bone was the surest engineering. Straight enough, long enough, strong in compression, and beautiful in its curve. What began as necessity hardened into knowledge and widened into culture. People learned which bones nested best, which tusks made the tightest arches, how much fat to paint into a seam so it would not crack in the 30 below dawn. Step outside one last time and turn back. The domes sit quiet, smoke threads fading into blue. They are not monuments by spring. Some hides will be moved, some frames left for later, some reinvented as windbreaks or butchering racks. What endures is the patterned circles of shelter, raised from what the land yields. Circles of faces lit by a small, tireless fire. In a place that could have been only hunger and weather, people built rooms for memory. The walls were bone, the mortar was story, the roof was hope stitched tight against the sky. What if the first art gallery on Earth smelled like tallow and stone? Imagine stepping into a throat of rock where your torch turns darkness into a shifting skin. The walls breathe as the flame wavers. Reds bloom, blacks deepen. Figures step forward from mineral veins. A bison angles its head as if listening. A mammoth sways, shoulders modeled by the bulge of the wall. Hoofbeats seem possible in a place where no hooves have ever fallen. You realize the pictures are not just on the cave, they are in it. Fitted to curves and shadows, as if the rock had been waiting to be found. The path here is narrow, wet underfoot, marked by fingers dragged through clay long before yours. Charcoal smears on the ceiling tell where a torch brushed stone. Flecks of calcite sparkle like frost. In a deeper chamber, the air opens and the acoustics change. Your breath comes back to you, round and warm. This is where the paintings gather, as if sound itself chose the gallery. On the walls, red and black bodies layered and overlapped, animals drawn with a confidence that feels modern horses in profile with elegant muzzles, aurochs with horns spinning out like crescents, lions with shoulders so present you could rest a palm there. At Chauvet, shading and perspective make them swell. At Lascaux, a torrent of forms floods the vault. At Altamira, bison ride the ceiling swell like living clouds. The artists were not dabblers. They knew how to turn stone into muscle. The kit was simple and exact. Black came from charcoal or manganese dioxide ground to powder. Red and yellow came from iron-rich ochres, burned or mixed to taste. Binders, animal fat, marrow, blood. Saliva made paint cling. Brushes were chewed twigs. Moss, hair, fine spray came from blowing pigment through hollow bone or cupped hands. Negative hand stencils bloom where someone pressed a palm to stone and breathed color around it. A biography in silhouette, nearby. Dots and signs, claviforms, ladders, branching marks repeat across caves and centuries. A script whose grammar we still guess. Engraving complements pigment flint incisions sharpen a main's edge. Scraped panels lift a pale undercoat so dark paint sings. Where the wall bulges, a shoulder becomes three-dimensional. Where the wall caves, a belly deepens. Light finishes the work torch flame animates. Each flicker a gate, a pivot, a turn of the head. Stay with us. Because the life inside these images is not only animal, beneath calcite films and soot. The caves hold traces of people moving with purpose. Footprints track a child's small steps alongside a dog-like companion. Heel marks stamp a path to a panel high on a wall where scaffolding must have stood. Lamps carved from limestone cradle fat and wick. Their soot a datable signature. A fallen torch. Radiocarbon's gift. Tells you when a hand passed. In some chambers. Finger flutings parallel grooves, left by hands dragged across soft rock swing, into spirals and waves. In others, palm prints dot ceilings too high for a standing reach, proof of ladders or clever platforms. The labor was deliberate. No one wandered here by accident, crushed a charcoal stick, and happened to invent grace. What did the images mean? The answer is layered, like the walls themselves. Once it was fashionable to say hunting magic paint the animal to master it. Another school leans toward shamanic visions. entoptic patterns, trance states, animals as spirit intermediaries. Others argue for teaching, memory, social identity, a herd's gait learned by tracing its hips and hocks, a place marked by a clan sign, a story fixed where it can't blow away. The truth may be all of these at once, and different on different nights. What the caves make plain is that survival wasn't only calories. People needed to see their world again under another kind of light to make it legible, shareable, beautiful, and therefore enduring. The choices of place sharpen the argument. Many masterpieces lie far from daylight, past squeezes that dissuade the casual, in chambers where the acoustics favor chant and drum. Clap once, and a painted horse shivers back to you. And a bison seems to gather itself. Some panels cluster at bends and thresholds, marking transitions. Others ride domes like constellations, a ceiling turned night sky. The placement suggests choreographies, processions with lamps, call and response songs, moments when a figure was revealed and covered again by darkness as the torch passed. Art here was performance as much as product, nor was pigment bound only to caves. Portable objects carried the same urgency, ivory and stone figurines with bodies abstracted into symbols of fertility or power. Engraved bones bearing ranks of notches that might be tallies or calendars, pendants stained with ochre and polished by skin. Each bead a day of travel, or a name you could touch. Outside the deep chambers, rock shelters kept simpler marks. Animals pecked into stone, hands printed at the boundaries of camp and country. The darkness was a studio, but meaning circulated in daylight, on bodies, through seasons, dating Titan's speculation into history. Radiocarbon clocks in charcoal and lamp soot fix moments of presence. Uranium-thorium clocks on thin calcite skins tell when paint lies beneath, and therefore older than the crust. The results unsettle any tidy timeline. Europe's deep art reaches beyond 30,000 years ago. Red discs and hand stencils in Spain press toward 40,000, across the world in Sulawesi. Hands and pigs challenge the idea that Europe monopolized the first spark. The implication is generous. The capacity for symbolic art traveled with us, ready to flare wherever stone and light conspired. Look again at a hand stencil. Some palms are broad, some slender. Finger lengths hint at women and men both leaving their signatures, though the method is debated and the categories modern. One hand missing a fingertip appears again and again on different panels, a person you could follow through years of visits. In one alcove, the same bison is repainted, overpainted, nudged forward by later artists, until the animal is a palimpsest of attempts, a community portrait in layers. The caves are not a single night's work. They are centuries of return. Back at the entrance, the last daylight dies to blue when the torches go out. The pictures evaporate and the cave reverts to its original owner's silence. But outside, the fire will be lit and the wall will be remembered. A child will copy a curve in dust. Someone will retell the hunt with hands shaping air. The next time the band returns, the lamp bowls will still be where they were set, the ladder stashed, the route known by feel. Art has done what it always does. When it matters, it has made time behave. If you listen, there's a faint hiss in the dark, the fat in a lamp, the breath behind pigment sprayed around a hand, That sound connects us more surely than any thesis. They were making meaning, not just making do. In the hardest places on Earth, they found a way to see the world twice and to let the second sight change the first. What if the darkness had rules, and none of them favored you? Step onto the step after sunset, and the world shrinks to what the fire can hold. Beyond that circle, the cold has eyes. A shape moves and vanishes. Breath hangs where nothing stands. Then a sound you feel more than hear pads in snow. A low chuff. The soft clatter of ice beards on a muzzle. In the Ice Age, hunters were everywhere. Some wore hooves. Some wore claws. Some wore our faces. Wolves were the rumor and the reality. Gray wolves learned our habits the way we learned theirs, circling camps at the far edge of light, testing midden heaps, shadowing drives, reading hesitation, dire wolves, broader of skull and heavier of jaw, hunted the plains in packs that could stand down most competitors at a carcass. Where herds were thick, both species became a moving weather, materializing at the first whiff of blood. To face them with a spear meant patience and nerve. To leave meat unattended was an invitation written in scent. Yet the line between rival and partner blurred even here. The calm and bold that tolerated our nearness edged closer to hearths. Their pups learned a new repertoire alarm early. Share later. Belong, if wolves were the chorus. Wolverines were the solo you didn't want to hear. Low to the ground, but all tendon and intent. A wolverine could make a strong person curse. They stole cached meat, shredded lashings, and defended prizes far larger than themselves with an indifference to injury that bordered on legend. In a land where every calorie had a destiny, a wolverine's raid could snap the thread of a plan. Countermeasures became part of the architecture: higher cache racks, double lashings, camps arranged to remove shadows where a small body could vanish until the right moment to sprint. Cats wrote their arguments in silence in Eurasia. Cave lions, likely maneless and long-limbed, moved with the night across the open ground, testing herds and people alike in the Americas. Saber-toothed cats hunted like sprung traps, no marathoners, but anchors, forelimbs thick as pillars for grappling, necks braced to drive long canines into soft, decisive places. A human alone on a ridge at dusk was not a hunter. A human alone was an equation a cat might solve. Bands answered with geometry watchposts, overlapping fields of firelight, habit trails kept clean of cover, dogs sleeping where their ears worked best. There were bigger shadows. Short-faced bears rose like sudden hills, long-legged and high-shouldered, perhaps built to run down opportunity and bully others off kills. Hyenas in the old world arrived as bone mills on legs, able to erase the evidence of a hunt by dawn. Even scavengers without big teeth carried veto power. Ravens could publish your success to every predator within sight of their circling. Foxes stitched denser scent maps than any human could read, leading larger noses to your door. Stay with us. Because the contest wasn't a straight line from they hunted us to we hunted them. It was a negotiation written in experiments. People learned the wind's grammar, how scent pools in hollows and rides ridges, and set camps where the night's approach could be read as sound long before it became teeth. They stacked mammoth bones not just into walls against weather, but into fences that forced a lunge to come awkwardly. They kept coals alive through sleep. So one breath and a twist of dry grass relit a perimeter. Fire was more than heat. It was a boundary marker every species could see at the kill. The balance was the sharpest. A mammoth or bison on the ground attracted a committee wolves first, then lions or bears, then the smaller guild, a band that arrived with little daylight left and too few hands could lose most of its work by morning. Solutions multiplied. Butchering triage fat and marrow first, high-value cuts next. Bones cracked and boiled in camp, with hot rocks turned minutes into meals. Sentries rotated with their backs to the fire so eyes could adjust to the dark. Children learned to read the metallic odor in the air that meant a large predator was near long before an adult said a word. Predators did their own calculus. A wolf learned which camps threw spears and which dropped meat. A lion learned what a ring of upright bodies meant, and when it was worth testing anyway. A wolverine learned the sound of a door lashing, and the moment it slackened. These were not caricatures of hunger. They were minds in motion, tuned to risk and return. The plains rules were written in margins, and every species could write notes. Evidence of the truce and its breaches is salted through the archaeology. Bones show healed fractures, people carried by others, until weight could be borne. Meaning the story didn't end at the ambush. Puncture marks on long bones matched jaws that did not belong to us. Cut marks cross-cut tooth marks where we fought predators for the same carcass and arrived first or didn't. At rock shelters. Paw prints press into old mud alongside human tracks. At cave mouths. Coprolites from carnivores and hearth ash interleave turns taken. Nights traded. Dogs changed the script as surely as fire. Even before sledges and harness. Canids that chose us extended our senses. A pair of pricked ears posted at the tunnel mouth bought seconds that mattered. A nose could find a rabbit under crust, and a cache an absent human could not. And when winter narrowed options to risky ones, a dog's willingness to stand at your knee and face the same direction tipped outcomes in quiet increments. Rivalry didn't vanish. It reorganized with a new player on our side of the field. None of this made us rulers. On some nights, we were food. On others, we were thieves. Often, we were neighbors whose property lines were made of smell and nerve. The Ice Age did not permit a fantasy where humans sat above the web. We lived inside it, bartering skill for safety, story for memory, and risk for fat. The astonishment is not that danger stalked the light, it's that culture made a space inside danger where singing and teaching were possible. Walk away from the fire's edge and listen. A wolf's call divides the horizon. A fox barks like a broken twig. Snow ticks off grass, somewhere far off. Ice shifts with a bass note that makes everything small. You're not the only one hearing. Every rival and every partner is arranging the next hour. The line between hunter and hunted will be drawn, as always, by timing. What if a river arrived all at once cold, gray, and taller than a city, then vanished in a day? Imagine ice jammed across a valley like a colossal plug. Behind it, a lake swells for seasons, then years, until its surface reaches the height of mountain saddles and spills into new basins. Pressure builds, water finds seams, the plug groans, and then the gate fails. A wall of meltwater and grinding stone lunges forward, not as a river, but as a moving landscape iceberg spinning. Boulders skipping like thrown dice. Whole hillsides peeled away as if by a giant fingernail. by the time the roar goes quiet. A gorge stands where pasture was, a cataract where a bend used to be, and ripples each the size of a house comb the ground to the horizon. The ice was never still. Sometimes it sprinted, start where the textbook turns into theater ice-dammed lakes. As glaciers advanced, they barricaded valleys. As they paused or retreated, melt water pooled against their flanks, making inland seas. A small leak became a torrent that scoured the underside of the ice itself. Friction melted more ice. Tunnels widened. The roof broke. The dam failed. Icelanders have a word for such outbursts, Jökulhlaups, and they still happen there under modern ice caps. But at the Pleistocene's close, some failures rewrote continents. Lake volumes equal to modern seas discharged in days to weeks. Rivers surged with more water than all the world's rivers combined, and erosion changed scale from patient artisan to demolition crew. The signatures of these megafloods are impossible to miss once you know the alphabet. There are giant current ripples, regular waves of gravel and sand, 10 to 20 meters high and spaced like corduroy across entire valleys. Their crests pointing downstream like arrows. There are scablands, tracks stripped to bare basalt, gouged with coulees, dry canyons, cataracts, and plunge pools large enough to drown cities. There are pendant bars, teardrop islands of boulders built in the lee of bedrock knobs, frozen mid-eddy when the water fell. There are erratics, lonely boulders the size of trucks and even barn-sized, rafted in on ice blocks and set down like riddles when the flood slackened. Each landform is a frame from a film you can run backward. Stay with us. Because the cast of floods spans the map. In the Pacific Northwest, ice lobes dammed the Clark Fork River again and again, forming glacial Lake Missoula. When the ice failed, water rushed west at freeway speed, blasting through eastern Washington to carve the channeled scablands, then thundering down the Columbia to help sculpt the gorge. Dry falls the cliff of a waterfall, 5 kilometers wide and taller than Niagara, never sees water now. But it was cut by water that ran for hours to days, many times over thousands of years. In Siberia's Altai, similar bars, ripples, and cataracts ring valleys where ice once barricaded routes. In Central Asia and the Alps, old rock remembers young torrents, even where floods didn't dominate. Rapid drainage changed coasts as proglacial lakes like Agassiz and Ojibwe spilled east or north. Sea level spiked and shorelines migrated in jolts instead of slides. The physics of such water is blunt and beautiful. Shear stress, the force scraping at the bed, goes as depth and slope. Raise depth by tens of meters, and you recruit boulders the size of cars. Then houses. Then whatever the valley offers. Turbulence organizes itself into vortices colks that pluck blocks of rock straight out of riverbeds, leaving round-bottomed potholes big enough to hide a school bus. Cavitation. The vapor bubbles born in extreme flow. Collapses with shock that hammers stone to flour, where floods press through bedrock gates. Head cuts leap upstream like reverse waterfalls, slicing gorges in days that normal rivers would need millennia to attempt. People were there to see it, even if they did not name it. Camps on what seemed like safe terraces woke to a horizon teething with water. Routes proved faithful for years suddenly snapped. Bands who cached meat in pits returned to find those pits gone. their landmarks rearranged. The prudent learned new caution about valleys that looked too neatly planed, about basins that filled to glass in a single thaw and sat like traps behind low walls of ice and grit. A good plan included a higher slope, a second ford, a story that began with, "If the river rises without rain, the climate machine heard the floods too." Drainage of northern lakes into the North Atlantic can freshen surface waters enough to slow the ocean's heat conveyor, cooling the north and shifting storm tracks. At the very end of the last glaciation, a sharp cold relapse the Younger Dryas has been linked, in some reconstructions, to massive freshwater pulses that upset circulation. Later, around 8,200 years ago, a final large outburst from the remnants of Lake Agassiz Ojibwe likely triggered a century-scale cooling visible in ice and caves worldwide. The line from valley-scale catastrophe to hemisphere-scale weather isn't always simple, but the evidence rhymes. Big floods tug hard on big systems. Megaflood marks also teach humility about tempo. We love to picture landscapes as patient, but some of the world's drama happens in bursts. A single Jokulhaup can rearrange a valley as thoroughly as 100,000 ordinary summers. A dozen repeated outbursts can sculpt a region, and once you know where to look, you start seeing flood handwriting everywhere, anabranching channels fossilized in bedrock, spillways that make no sense under modern flow, flat-floored coulees that end at cliffs because the river that made them was temporary and immense. There is wonder in the cleanup, too. As flood rage eases, water drops its heaviest cargo first. Boulders settle into bars, gravel quilts the ground, silt and rock flour drift out farther. Turning seas, turquoise, and feeding plankton blooms that knit another piece of the climate puzzle. New lakes occupy, scoured basins, wetlands garrison the floodplain. Salmon and sturgeon find ladders through fresh canyons. Humans return cautiously, reading the new grammar of the land where a bluff now offers a view to watch herds, where a side channel promises fish, where an old path is gone and an unexpected one invites. Walk any of these places today, and the noise is gone, but the scale remains. Stand above dry falls and imagine water where air now is. Hike a coulee and run your hand over basalt scoured to a polish. Climb a ripple and understand, in your calves, that this ripple is taller than your house. Pick up a pebble in a field and know the field is a bar laid down by a current that could lift buses. The lesson the Ice Age keeps pressing is simple. Calm landscapes can be the aftermath of violence. If rivers teach patience, floods teach respect. The ice was not a frozen wall, so much as an engineer with moods. When it melted gently, it braided rivers and fed grass. When it let go all at once, it wrote gorges. Either way, it left a planet we still recognize, channels that steer our water, soils that feed our crops, cliffs that launch our awe. The map we carry in our heads was drawn in part by days when the world ran fast. What if the seafloor you fly over now was once a road wide, grassy, and alive with hoofprints? Picture the world's shorelines stepping outward like a low tide on a planetary scale. As ice sheets locked up water, sea level fell more than 100 meters, and oceans pulled back to reveal new countries made of light and wind. These weren't skinny causeways. They were homelands. The largest of them, Beringia stretched from Siberia to Alaska as a subcontinent of steppe and river, a cold green prairie where mammoth trails braided with human paths, and bison churned the ground to a soft drum. Beringia felt familiar to everything built for the Ice Age. Grasses and forbs ran for weeks each summer across dust-sweet loess. Rivers like the Kalima and the Yukon wandered wide and lazy over permafrost. Foxes stitched the hills with quick feet. Wolves read every scent. Ravens published every kill to the sky. Mammoths swept snow aside to open feeding windows that fed half the neighborhood, and people small bands with stone. Bone and fire treated the plain not as a bridge, but as a country. Camps rose on low ridges to catch wind and keep insects gentle. Skin tents faced the sun. Dogs paced the threshold and made the night arrive a little later. Stay with us. Because the route across wasn't simply left to right on a map. Gates opened and closed with climate to the south. Ice sheets sometimes knitted the continent shut. To the west, the Lena and Indigirka flooded and froze by turns. Some groups lingered for generations, what geneticists call a Beringian standstill, while the world decided when to move again, when warmth returned and ice withdrew. Two pathways argued for primacy. Inland, the so-called ice-free corridor slowly greened. Rivers carved channels, and herds and people explored a corridor with food enough to matter. Along the coast, a living pantry of kelp, shellfish, and seabirds. The kelp highway may have ferried travelers by shore and small craft. Round headlands and into river mouths, either way. The old grassland became ancestry, and the sea later drowned it. Beringia wasn't the only stage the oceans gave and took. Northwest Europe once carried a drowned kingdom called Doggerland, a low, rolling plain and wetland that connected Britain to the continent. Reindeer lanes crossed it in winter. In summer, marsh and lake fed fishers and fowlers. Mesolithic camps dotted levees and sandy rises, their hearths looking out over reeds where red deer moved like whispers. Then the water rose and kept rising. Rivers rearranged, peatlands sank, and at last waves claimed the ground. One day it was a field that carried footsteps, another, a shoal where cod turned. Memory followed the shoreline back, and legends about lost lands followed memory farther south. The tropics had their own architecture of exposure. Across Southeast Asia, lowered seas fused islands into the Sunda Shelf, a broad peninsula of rainforest and savanna that reached toward Borneo and Java. To the east lay Wallacea, a scatter of deep-water islands that never joined. Beyond that, the Sahul Shelf merged Australia and New Guinea into a single continent with giant wombats, thunderbirds, and marsupial lions. People threaded this maze by water long before most coastlines we know existed, launching into channels where you could no longer see both shores at once, then landing to walk a new world under unfamiliar stars. These crossings repeated, intentional hint at a maritime confidence that surprises until you remember the urge that drives all travel a ridge over there. A cloud bank colored like land, a story that says the sea can be persuaded. Elsewhere, shelves made corridors, then erased them. The Yellow Sea was once a grassland plain, braided by the Paleo-Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. Sakhalin and Hokkaido sat on a walkway for deer and people moving between the continent and Japan. In the Americas, The exposed Gulf shelf turned bays to meadows and multiplied coastal river mouths into rich, seasonal kitchens. Each of these places wrote and rewrote routes as the water line ticked up or down, offering windows of decades or centuries for movement, then closing the book. Land bridges did more than ferry bodies. They moved ideas and stones obsidian from a far volcano, shell from a bright reef, ochre the color of a particular sunrise. They folded wolves toward us, and us toward wolves. They braided languages and unbraided them again when seas rose and turned neighbors into islanders, for animals. They were gates of gene flow when the gates shut. Evolution wrote new endings dwarf mammoths on islands, flightless birds without mammalian predators, foxes with dialects of behavior tuned to new winds. When the ice relaxed its grip, the same bridges turned into traps. Beringia sank into a strait choked with tidal rips. Doggerland broke into sandbanks and then into rumor. Rivers surged into bays where people had once camped. A shoreline that moves a mile in a lifetime can still feel like betrayal. Bands that had read the land for generations learned to read the sea, its rack lines, its moods, its safe harbors, and they stacked stories against the change how to pack fast, where to lift a house and carry it inland, which hill remembers a flood in its soil. Walk the maps today, and you can still see the ghost roads. Fishermen on the North Sea haul up hazelnuts and antlers in their nets. Arctic coasts give back mammoth bones from river bluffs cut into permafrost. Sonar traces river channels across continental shelves where salmon once ran through air. In museums, stone points and beads lie side by side, though the sources that made them are now separated by salt. The land bridges did not disappear, so much as convert into evidence. The Ice Age keeps reminding us that geography is a verb, the sea is a patient editor, and ice is an impatient one when they collaborate. Worlds appear and vanish with consequences measured in ancestors. The miracle is not merely that people crossed, it's that they stayed long enough to make these temporary continents into places named, mapped in song, committed to memory, and carried forward after the water returned to claim them. What if extinction doesn't sound like a bang, but like grass turning into trees? Imagine a horizon that once moved with backs and tusks, mammoths clearing snow with sweeping arcs, bison pulsing like weather slowly dimming as shrubs take root, then saplings, then a roof of needles and leaves. The steppes' wide pantry narrows into aisles. Light changes, paths close. Calves born to run find shade instead of wind. You don't notice it in a day. You notice it when a trail used for generations ends at a wall of green. This is how giants go, not always in panic, often in attrition, as the last glacial maximum eased. Warmth didn't just melt ice. It reprogrammed landscapes, where the mammoth steppe had been cold, bright, and dry. The early Holocene tilted toward wetter soils and longer growing seasons. Birch and pine advanced across Eurasia. Spruce and hardwoods climbed through North America. Sedge meadows became thickets. Open ground stitched itself into forest. Productivity did not vanish, but it changed address and timing. For grazers optimized for low, mineral-rich forage, and for hunters keyed to those movements, habitat quality slid. A matriarch's memory map, priceless in open country, began to fail under a canopy. On a map of time, the die-off looks like a wave with regional accents. In Australia, many large marsupials were gone by 45 to 50,000 years ago. In the Americas, the toll rose sharply after 13 to 12,000 years. So go mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, American lions, dire wolves in northern Eurasia. Mammoths retreated in patchwork until a few holdouts survived on island St. Paul in the Bering Sea until 500–600 years ago. Wrangel in the Arctic until 4000, long after mainland kin had vanished. That staggered timing is the first clue that no single lever explains everything everywhere. Climate was a lever. Vegetation turnovers replaced grasses and forbs with shrubs and trees. Snow regimes shifted. Wetlands expanded and dried in new rhythms. Insect burdens and pathogens changed ranges. For big-bodied herbivores living close to energetic limits in winter. Even subtle mismatches ice crusts after rain on snow. Late springs. Fewer windswept ridges cut survival and calf recruitment. Predators felt those tremors too. A food web tuned to short. Bright summers and long, lean winters had to retune to shade, mast, and browse. Humans were a lever as well. And our fingerprints are clearest at edges in time and space. Wherever people arrived newly into Australia, into the Americas, onto islands, extinctions followed more quickly than climate alone would predict. The overkill hypothesis imagines a blitz, efficient hunters targeting naive prey with low reproductive rates, removing just enough adults that populations tipped over a cliff. Spear points lodged in mammoth ribs. Cut marks crossing tooth scores. Mass kill sites at cliff edges. These are the case exhibits. Alongside models showing that small increases in adult mortality unravel slow-breeding giants. A quieter variant, sometimes called Sitzkrieg, points to cumulative pressure, selective hunting of the fattest. Disturbance at waterholes. Fires reshaping mosaics. Dogs changing predator-prey theater. Stay with us, because the evidence doesn't sit neatly in one box in some regions. Climate and habitat change alone seem sufficient to explain declines in others. Human arrival lines up too tightly with disappearance to ignore. Isotopes inside tusk and tooth show diet stress setting in before the last breath. Dung fungus spores in lake cores track herd abundance dropping in step with vegetation shifts and with archaeological signatures of people on Wrangel. Genomes of the last mammoths carry scars of isolation inbreeding. Mutation loads that may have harmed smell, fertility, and coat proof that small populations can survive a while but become brittle. No single story wins everywhere. The best fit is a partnership climate hems the giants in. People press on the hem. Numbers favored the small and the fast. Mammoths invested years to make one calf. Bison and horses did better, but still relied on predictable grass. A handful of bad cohorts, and demographic gears grind. Add a new predator that can coordinate at scale. Throw fire, and carry sharp edges farther and faster than any tooth. And the buffer thins. Even low hunting rates, if focused on prime adults, can push slow life histories past recovery. The math is cold, and, once you see it, tragically elegant. The world the giants left behind reconfigured itself in their absence, without heavy grazing and trampling. Shrubs advanced. Nutrient flows slowed as dung ceased to shuttle minerals between patches. Seeds that once rode in bellies moved shorter distances. Carrion guilds ravens, foxes, Hyenas, where they remained, lost jackpots and had to live on smaller winnings. Predators tuned to big game lost footing. Some vanished, others downsized their expectations. Rivers and prairies still ran and grew, but the tempo changed. The silence you feel at certain latitudes isn't just fewer sounds, it's a different kind of work being done by the land. People adjusted too. In the Americas, as mammoths and mastodons faded, diets diversified: more deer, more small game, more fish and plants. Technologies shifted. Settlement patterns loosened and recombined. In Europe and Asia, reindeer, elk, and boar took center stage where mammoth had been the emblem. Bone huts of the deep cold gave way to timber frames where forests allowed. Points slimmed and multiplied. Nets and traps accrued the small advantages of patience. Culture, which had learned to live beside giants, learned to live without them. We kept memory, though. And memory kept a pressure of its own long after the last tusks sank under peat. Stories of enormous animals threaded winter talk. The debate endures because it matters beyond the forensic. If climate alone can empty a continent of big animals, then warming is a loaded dice we should read with care. If small human pressures can tip slow breeders into oblivion, then modern pressures far larger, more numerous, carry responsibilities we cannot shrug. If it was both edges drawn by climate, cuts made by us, then both is the honest word we should teach. It is also the hardest, because it admits our species as a geologic force braided into natural cycles rather than apart from them. Walk an open steppe today and try to imagine the ground moving again with long shadows and breathing clouds. You can't. Not fully. The absence is too complete, yet traces lie everywhere lest that fed the grass. Bones eroding from permafrost cutbanks, pollen records that document the handover from light-loving grasses to shade, sequences in museums and laptops that resurrect kinships and bottlenecks. In the fossil of a tusk ring that tightened during a lean winter, you can feel the hinge creak. What haunts isn't only the loss of size, it's the loss of tempo and relationship. The Ice Age giants taught landscapes to behave in certain ways, and landscapes taught the giants in return. We stepped into that conversation late and, for a while, spoke too loudly. The task now is to learn to listen again, to see how abundance depends on timing and room, how quickly slow lives can be unmade, and how much meaning can be salvaged by telling the story straight. What if the loudest change after the ice wasn't a flood or a crack of calving ice, but the soft hiss of leaves? Imagine the steppe's long horizon folding inward as birch flashes first. White trunks marching across raw till like scout banners. Pine follows, dark and resin-scented, knitting wind into shade. Then oak, elm, hazel broad leaves turning light into sugar and the ground into soil. Where the world had once been open all distance and angle rooms appear glades, coppice, river corridors roofed with green. The land lowers its voice and learns to breathe through forests. Birch and pine are the pioneers, quick to root in rubble and sand, tolerant of cold snaps and thin soils. Their needles and leaves fall as the first litter, feeding fungi and invertebrates that grind mineral into meal. Mycorrhizae lace the ground into a living web. Beetles and earthworms write tunnels. Mosses hold moisture where wind once drank it. In their lee, Slower airs take hold oak with its deep shade and heavy mast, elm with a canopy fine as lace, hazel with spring catkins and summer nuts. This is succession, written not in decades, but in human generations. Your children grow under saplings. Your grandchildren under shade. Stay with us. Because the forest is an engine, not a backdrop. Closed canopies cool the soil and smooth the seasons. Snow lingers darker and wetter. Summer heat softens into damp. Rivers slow, swing, and braid through alder fen and willow beds. Oxbows heal into ponds that remember the old channel in a crescent of sky. Beavers return to easy timber and begin to edit valleys with patient teeth, backing water into wetlands that thicken birdsong and insect haze. Where loess once lay bare to wind, leaf litter pins it down and grows it deeper. In Europe and Asia alike, pollen in lake mud records the takeover birch spikes, pine swells, then broadleaf waves, local mosaics, but the same drift trees reclaiming the light. The animal cast reshuffles with the stage. Elk ghost through galleries of trunk and shade. Red deer browse forest edge. Wild boar plow the understory into seed beds that look like rot to us and opportunity to everything else. Wolves adjust from open country pursuit to ambush and patient haunting of paths that smell like deer. Lynx pads along deadwood highways where the canopy filters sun into coins on the forest floor. Birds restitch the soundscape woodpecker's drum. Thrushes roll liquid phrases. Owls sow the dusk with questions. Even the insects tell time differently, hear less windburn. More hum. For people raised on wind and horizon, the learning curve is abrupt and intimate. A stalker of bison on open steppe becomes a reader of trails game tracks as narrow as a hand. Runs between hazel clumps, fresh bark scars where antler cleaned velvet. Microliths in composite arrows replace heavy spearheads. Snares and nets rise in importance, along with quiet patience. Hazelnuts pile in pits like jars of light against winter. Mushrooms and berries thicken the seasonal calendar. Fish weirs in lowland rivers turn the spring melt into certainty. Hearth smoke threads up through leaf and limb instead of streaming across miles. And then, almost invisibly at first, the forest opens a new door, along the sunlit margins and on floodplains where silt renews itself. People begin to keep the plants they like closer. In the southeast, far fields wheat, barley, lentils have already long been coaxed from wild into crop. Sheep, goats, and cattle learn the bargain of salt, water, and fence. Those ideas walk and row and marry their way northwest, up the great corridors of the Danube and Rhine, across the loess belts that cut Europe like ribbons of promise. Clearings widen around longhouses, polished stone axes bite into trunks, fire finishes what stone starts. Pollen curves bend a dip in elm, a surge in grasses, a fingerprint of human opening within the green. The shoreline edits itself as well. Doggerland drowns, and memory relocates upslope. Estuaries creep inland, turning valleys into bays where fish grow fat on forest tea along the Baltic. Amber glows in hands and trade routes along the Black Sea and Caspian. Reeds whisper at the feet of villages that read flood and drought like news in China. Loess hills hold patchworks of forest and field in Anatolia and the Zagros. Oak parklands and pistachio stands mingle with the first orchards. The Holocene leans warm especially in middle millennia, and the green world takes that invitation seriously. Forests are not just larders, they are libraries. Wood becomes architecture and instrument beams. Bowls, bent ribs of boats, frames for nets and hides, flutes bored from elder and bone. Bark writes in tars and fibers, resins glue and heal, tannins turn skin into leather that survives a life. Trails become roads, then stories, then borders. Clearings recur in the same places until place is a habit that survives the house that made it. The village follows the field follows the soil follows the forest that made it. Civilization's grammar granary, fence, threshold, path declines from words the woods taught. None of this is smooth. Forests burn and resprout. Pests and disease write their own edits. The great mid-Holocene elm decline reminds us that trees have enemies and histories of their own. Storms scythe, rivers unbraid, fields fail when farmers forget that soil is a living quorum and not a pile of dirt. Yet the direction holds from open to patterned, from chase to tend, from camp to village. The Ice Age did not end with a curtain drop. It ended with shadows under leaves and a new kind of work done by hands. Walk into a modern beechwood or oakwood and listen. You're hearing a long aftermath, the hush of canopy, the give of humus underfoot, the inflected silence that lets a human voice carry just far enough to gather, to teach, to stay. The green world did more than return. It made rooms where law, memory, and promise could sit down together. Out of shade and mast and clear water came fences and songs and the first mapped futures. What if you never really left the Ice Age? What if you just learned to walk on top of it? Look down. The fields that feed you are often ground to silk by vanished glaciers. Loess, the fine rock flower lofted by Ice Age winds, still fattens black soils from China's plateau to the American Midwest. Look out. Chains of blue lakes stitched across maps are kettles left when dead ice blocks melted in place. Whole inland seas, like the Great Lakes, fill basins carved by ice thick enough to bow the crust. Even the hills have a glacial accent, whale-backed bedrock polished smooth in one direction, plucked ragged in the other, with lone, erratic boulders set down like punctuation from a language the ice once spoke. Follow the shorelines. Around northern bays, you can hike old beach ridges like rings in a tub, strand lines that step uphill because the land is still rising after the weight came off. Scandinavia, Scotland, Canada. The crust remembers pressure in slow motion. Rivers remember too. Many modern courses are opportunists, captured by the channels and outwash plains that floods and meltwater left behind. Stand at the lip of a dry waterfall, like dry falls in Washington state, or at the mouth of a fjord, where mountains let the sea in, and you are reading a map revised by days of catastrophe and millennia of patience. Stay with us, because the Ice Age lives in your stories as surely as in your soil. Long after mammoths were gone, cultures told of giants and thunder beasts, of world floods and cracking skies. Erratics became altars and legends. Caves remained places where night gathers meaning. The instinct to circle a fire, to watch faces flicker into life at the edge of dark, is not nostalgia. It's an old solution that still works heat. Light, attention braided into trust. We call it comfort. Our ancestors called it evening safety. Some inheritances are quieter. Dogs at our feet trace a bargain, struck beside Ice Age hearths you warn and help hunt. We share and shelter our daylight preferences, our fascination with horizons and weather, our alertness to movement at the edge of vision, all feel at home under a big sky that remembers wolves. Even foodways keep echoes the urge for dense calories when cold arrives, the satisfaction of fat and broth, the way smoked and dried flavors taste like competence. Our cities sit on Ice Age scaffolding. Northern Europe's farming heartlands ride on loess belts. Central Europe's river corridors still follow glacial spillways. North America's metropolises fringe lakes gouged by ice and stabilized by outwash. Ports serve drowned valleys, rias, and fjords where glaciers and rising seas conspired to make deep. Safe water. Roads and railways thread passes first opened by ice and widened by melt. We layer glass and steel on a foundation quarried by a climate machine that once ran colder. The Ice Age also lives in our math. Ice cores and cave dripstones still meter time and teach thresholds. Stranded shorelines and uplifted coasts show how the planet rebounds and how slowly. Lake sediments keep the barcodes of dung fungi that rise and fall with herds. Ocean muds hold the isotope signatures of global ice and heat. From those records, we learned humility. Climate can glide, but it can leap. Small astronomical nudges can be amplified by feedbacks into continents' worth of change. It is not ancient trivia. It is the owner's manual we keep rediscovering. Even absence is a presence. Where giants once engineered landscapes, trampling, mowing, moving nutrients, forests and shrubs returned. That shift rewrote fire regimes, soils, and animal communities, and then we rewrote them again with axes, plows, and fences. The debate over why the giants died climate, people, or both still matters because it tests how lightly or heavily our species steps on slow lives. The Ice Age's last chapters remind us that both is a hard, honest answer. Listen to place names. Drift, Till, Moraine, Came, Eskers. They are field guides hiding in plain sight. Hike a drumlin field and feel the flow direction in your calves. Sit by a kettle pond and watch dragonflies patrol air that was once ice. Drive across a prairie and know that its richness began as powder beneath a mile of glacier. The familiar wears a Pleistocene undercoat, and listen to yourself. The comfort of drawing close when storms build. The reflex to face the door, to sit with your back to something solid. The hush that falls when snow begins and the world's edges blur. These are not quaint habits. They are working memory from deep time. The Ice Age is the prologue to our rooms and our rituals. The reason certain landscapes feel like home and certain dangers feel legible. If you trace a finger across a modern atlas, you are tracing the ghost hand of ice and melt, wind and flood. If you hold a handful of dark soil and let it run, you are holding ground made by pressure, carried by air, settled by luck, and kept by care. The Ice Age within us is not frost. It is form of land, of culture, of attention. We did not leave it behind. We stand on it. We breathe its lessons. And when we gather by any kind of fire to trade stories, we keep it warm,